In a town where discrimination is the norm, Thomas, a brilliant but underestimated young black man, faces challenges at every turn. Despite his intelligence and work ethic, he can't catch a break. A local businessman, Mr. Thompson, offers him a job as a janitor, a role far beneath his capabilities. Yet Thomas takes the job, hoping it's a chance to prove himself. But as racial slurs and harassment plague him daily, he wonders if he made the right decision. His struggles intensify when a valuable piece of jewelry is stolen from Mr. Thompson's office, and Thomas is immediately suspected. Convinced he's being set up, Thomas uncovers secrets that go deeper than just a stolen necklace. Little does he know, what he's about to reveal will shake the town to its core. Will Thomas get the justice he deserves, or will the weight of discrimination crush his spirit for good? But before we dive into this incredible journey of courage and resilience, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Join our community and be the first to hear inspiring stories like Thomas's, where every voice matters and every fight for justice is celebrated. Don't miss out on the impact we can make together. The town of Cedar Ridge, nestled in the rolling hills of the American South, was a place where time seemed to stand still. It was a small, predominantly white community where people prided themselves on tradition, hard work, and the belief that things had their proper place. But beneath its picturesque surface, Cedar Ridge had an unspoken, insidious order. Some were meant to prosper, while others, like Thomas, were meant to stay in the shadows. Thomas Harris had known Cedar Ridge all his life. He'd grown up there, walked its quiet streets, played in its fields, and attended its schools. His parents, hard-working and determined, had always told him that with perseverance he could achieve anything. But even as a child, Thomas knew this was only half true. His family wasn't wealthy and they weren't white, a combination that seemed to place an invisible barrier between him and the opportunities that others took for granted. As a boy, Thomas had been curious, bright, and full of dreams. He was the kind of child who would dismantle radios just to see how they worked, who spent hours reading books about great inventors, and who scribbled ideas for inventions in his worn-out notebook. But even then, he knew that Cedar Ridge didn't quite welcome his ambition. His classmates were quick to remind him of his place. "You're smart for someone like you," they would say with condescension that stung more than any overt insult. Even the teachers, though never openly hostile, would give him less attention than they gave his white peers. Now, at 22, Thomas had just graduated from the local community college with top honors. His parents had beamed with pride at the ceremony, knowing how hard he had worked. But Cedar Ridge hadn't changed, not for him. Despite his qualifications, every door seemed firmly shut in his face. He applied for job after job, each rejection more disheartening than the last. Sometimes they were polite, saying he was overqualified or that they weren't hiring. Other times it was clear that his skin color was the real issue. No one said it outright, but Thomas could read between the lines. He could see the discomfort in their eyes, the way their voices would tighten when he introduced himself. In truth, Cedar Ridge wasn't overtly hostile. It wasn't the kind of place where people shouted racial slurs on the streets. No, it was more insidious than that. The racism in Cedar Ridge was quiet, polite, and deeply entrenched. The people of Cedar Ridge prided themselves on being good, decent folk. They didn't believe they were racist. They believed they were protecting tradition, preserving the town's identity. But for Thomas, every polite smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, every handshake that was a little too quick to end, every opportunity denied, was a reminder that no matter how hard he worked, he would never be one of them. Thomas's family had lived in Cedar Ridge for generations, ever since his great-grandparents had moved there in search of work. They had seen the town through its toughest times, Through economic downturns, through the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, and through countless storms, both literal and figurative. But despite their loyalty to the town, despite their contributions, they were still seen as outsiders. Thomas's father, Samuel, worked as a mechanic at the local garage, and his mother, Dolores, cleaned houses for some of the wealthier families in town. They worked hard, never complained, and kept to themselves, just like their parents had taught them. Samuel had always been a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He had taught Thomas the value of hard work, the importance of perseverance. "Son," he would say, "the world's not fair, but that doesn't mean you stop trying." It was a lesson Thomas had internalized early on. He knew the deck was stacked against him, but he wasn't the type to give up easily. Still, as much as Thomas believed in hard work, there were moments when the weight of Cedar Ridge's prejudice felt unbearable. He watched as his white classmates, many of whom had barely passed their exams, were given opportunities that were denied to him. They secured jobs at the local bank, in the real estate office, and at the factory, while Thomas, with his intelligence and degree, was left to struggle. His rejections weren't based on his qualifications. Everyone in town knew he was smart. They were based on something else, something deeper. He was black, and in Cedar Ridge, that was all that mattered. Every day Thomas walked through the town with his head held high, but inside he wrestled with frustration and anger. He saw the same old men sitting on the porch of the general store, the same tired gossip about who was doing what, the same polite exchanges that concealed a much darker reality. He saw the Confederate flags that still hung in a few windows, the way some people clung to the past as if it were sacred. It wasn't just the jobs, though. Thomas faced microaggressions at nearly every turn. He couldn't walk into a store without feeling the eyes of the clerk follow him, watching him as though he might steal something. He couldn't stand in line at the grocery store without someone cutting in front of him, pretending not to see him standing there. The people of Cedar Ridge didn't scream at him or shove him, but they made it clear, in their own quiet way, that he didn't belong. But despite all of this, Thomas wasn't willing to leave Cedar Ridge. It was his home, for better or worse. His parents were here, his roots were here, and as much as he hated the way the town treated him, he was determined to stay and make a life for himself. He believed in his own abilities, even if no one else did. He believed that one day, somehow, he would prove everyone wrong. What Thomas didn't know, though, was that his determination would soon be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. Cedar Ridge wasn't just a town steeped in prejudice. It was a town hiding secrets, and soon those secrets would come to light. And when they did, Thomas would find himself at the center of a storm that would change his life and the town forever. Thomas stared at the framed certificate on the wall of his small bedroom, the one declaring him a proud graduate of the local community college. He had earned a degree in engineering, a feat he'd worked tirelessly to achieve. Late nights spent studying in his cramped room, weekends sacrificed to projects, and the heavy weight of his family's expectations had all led to this moment. The paper was proof of his accomplishment, a symbol of what he was capable of. But lately it felt like a cruel reminder of dreams that seemed further out of reach than ever. He had applied to every job he could find within a 50-mile radius of Cedar Ridge. Each rejection hit harder than the last. Some companies didn't even bother responding, while others sent form letters with hollow apologies about choosing another candidate. A few times he'd been called in for interviews. He'd show up in his best shirt and tie, nerves bouncing in his chest, only to see the eyes of the interviewers glaze over as soon as they shook his hand. It didn't matter how well he answered their questions. They weren't interested in hiring someone like him. On more than one occasion, Thomas had left interviews with the sinking feeling that the decision had been made before he ever walked through the door. "We'll be in touch," they would say. But he could hear the finality in their voices. He was invisible, and his qualifications meant nothing in a town like Cedar Ridge. The frustration ate at him. He had done everything right. He had studied hard, stayed out of trouble, made his parents proud. His father's voice echoed in his head. "The world's not fair, but that doesn't mean you stop trying." It was a mantra he had lived by for years, but lately it felt more like a burden than a guiding principle. One evening, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with his mother, Dolores, who was peeling potatoes for dinner. The room smelled of simmering stew, and the faint hum of a local radio station played in the background. Dolores had just returned from a long day cleaning houses, her hands rough and red from scrubbing floors and countertops. She worked for some of the wealthiest families in Cedar Ridge, people who lived in large, sprawling homes with manicured lawns and fancy cars. They barely acknowledged her when she arrived to clean, treating her like part of the furniture. "Anything new today?" she asked, her voice soft but hopeful. Thomas sighed, pushing his chair back and staring at the ceiling. "Another rejection," he muttered. "They said they were going in a different direction." His mother didn't say anything at first, but he could feel her disappointment hanging in the air. Not disappointment in him, but in the world they lived in, a world that didn't see her son for who he truly was. "You're doing everything you can," she said, her voice gentle. "It's not you, Thomas. It's this town. They don't want to see people like us succeed." "I know," he replied, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. "But it just feels like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough." Dolores set down the knife and looked at him with tired eyes. "You know your father had the same struggles. He worked his whole life in that garage fixing other people's cars, and half the time they didn't even have the decency to say thank you. But he kept going. You've got that same fire in you, Thomas." Thomas clenched his fists under the table. He knew his mother meant well, but the comparison only added to his frustration. His father had worked in that garage for nearly 30 years, and while he was respected for his skills, he had never been able to break free from the role assigned to him. Thomas didn't want that life. He wanted more. He wanted a future where he could use his mind, where his talents were recognized, not just tolerated. The next day, Thomas sat in front of his laptop staring at a job application for a position at an engineering firm. Thomas sat hunched over his laptop, staring at the blinking cursor on the screen. It was another job application, this time for a small engineering firm 2 towns over. He filled in the same details he had typed out countless times, education, experience, references, but even as his fingers moved across the keys, a creeping sense of futility settled in. It was like throwing stones into a bottomless well, each application disappearing into the void, never to be heard from again. He took a deep breath and closed the laptop, resting his head in his hands. He was tired. Tired of rejection, tired of always feeling like he wasn't good enough, tired of trying so hard for something that seemed impossible to grasp. The town of Cedar Ridge had become a cage, and he couldn't find a way out. Just as he was about to push himself away from the table, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a name he hadn't expected, Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson was a well-known figure in Cedar Ridge. He owned several businesses in town and was respected by most of the community. Thomas's mother worked for one of his wealthy neighbors, and from what she had said, Mr. Thompson was the kind of man who believed in maintaining order and keeping things the way they'd always been. He had money, power, and influence, and that made him untouchable in a place like Cedar Ridge. Curious, Thomas answered the call. "Hello?" he said, unsure of what to expect. "Thomas, this is Richard Thompson," the voice on the other end began, deep and authoritative. "I understand you've been looking for work." Thomas felt a flicker of hope, but kept his tone neutral. "Yes, sir, I have." "Well, I've heard good things about you from a few folks in town," Mr. Thompson continued. "You've got a degree, you're smart, and you're not afraid of hard work. I think I might have something for you." Thomas's heart raced. Was this the break he had been waiting for? Someone as influential as Mr. Thompson offering him a job could mean a step towards something bigger, something better. "I run a few businesses, as you probably know," Mr. Thompson went on, "and I've got a position open for someone with your skills. It's not exactly in your field, more of a janitorial role, but I think you'll find it's a good start. You'd be working in one of my office buildings, cleaning, fixing things, keeping the place in order. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work." The hope Thomas had felt seconds before began to crumble. A janitorial role? He had a degree in engineering, for God's sake. He was looking for a career, not a job that anyone with a high school diploma could do. For a moment, he considered rejecting the offer outright. But then the weight of reality settled over him. He had been searching for months and hadn't gotten anywhere. His savings were drying up, and he couldn't keep relying on his parents to support him. Swallowing his pride, Thomas forced himself to respond. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thompson," he said slowly, "but I was hoping to find something more in line with my degree." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Thomas could hear Mr. Thompson breathe out, a slight note of impatience creeping into his voice. "I understand, son, but in this town, you've got to take what you can get. A job's a job, and it's better than nothing. Look, you come in, do the work, and who knows, maybe down the line other opportunities will open up. But for now, I can't promise anything more than that." Thomas felt a knot tighten in his chest. He hated the idea of being stuck in a role that was beneath his qualifications, but what choice did he have? Cedar Ridge wasn't exactly overflowing with opportunities, and a job at one of Mr. Thompson's businesses would at least give him a steady paycheck. Maybe it wouldn't be forever. Maybe it was a stepping stone. "When would you want me to start?" Thomas asked, his voice betraying a hint of resignation. "As soon as possible," Mr. Thompson replied, satisfaction evident in his tone. "Come by my office tomorrow morning. We'll get you set up and ready to go." Thomas hung up the phone, staring at the screen as the call ended. He felt a mixture of frustration and defeat. This wasn't what he had envisioned for himself. He hadn't spent years studying and working to end up cleaning floors. But in a town like Cedar Ridge, sometimes dreams had to be deferred, and survival took precedence. The next morning, Thomas found himself standing outside Mr. Thompson's office building. It was one of the largest in town, a gleaming structure that stood in stark contrast to the more worn-down businesses that lined Cedar Ridge's main street. As he stepped inside, the receptionist, a woman in her late 40s with a tight smile and cold eyes, directed him towards the back. Mr. Thompson's office was exactly what Thomas had expected: expensive wood paneling, leather chairs, and shelves lined with books that had probably never been read. Mr. Thompson himself sat behind a large mahogany desk, dressed in a crisp suit that screamed wealth and power. He greeted Thomas with a firm handshake and gestured for him to sit. "Well, Thomas, glad you're here," Mr. Thompson said, leaning back in his chair. "We'll get you started right away. Your duties will be simple: cleaning the offices, maintaining the building, and keeping everything in working order. Do your job well, and there might be more for you in the future. But don't expect any handouts." Thomas nodded, biting back the frustration that surged inside him. He wanted to scream that he was more than just a janitor, that he was capable of so much more. But instead he forced a smile and thanked Mr. Thompson for the opportunity. As he walked out of the office, his new uniform in hand, Thomas felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had dreamed of working in an office, not cleaning it. But for now, this was the reality he had to accept. He stepped into the hallway, where the sounds of phones ringing and office workers chatting filled the air. No one paid him any attention. To them, he was invisible. Just another janitor. Just another man doing a job that no one else wanted. But as Thomas gripped the uniform in his hands, one thought echoed in his mind. "This is temporary. I'll prove them wrong. I'll show them what I'm really capable of." Thomas entered the office building the next morning, his freshly pressed janitor's uniform feeling like a weight on his shoulders. The building, modern and spotless, stood in stark contrast to the grim reality of the role he was about to embrace. He walked through the lobby, trying to ignore the way the receptionists barely glanced at him, their eyes glossing over him like he was part of the scenery. It was a role he hadn't wanted but had reluctantly accepted, one he hoped would lead to something better. But as the days went by, it became clear that the job wasn't just about mopping floors and taking out the trash. The real struggle wasn't the physical labor, it was the constant undercurrent of disrespect and humiliation that accompanied every task. Thomas had faced prejudice in Cedar Ridge all his life, but now, in this sterile office building, it was on full display. His co-workers barely acknowledged his existence. They walked past him as if he were invisible, muttering under their breath or laughing when they thought he couldn't hear. The worst offenders were the junior executives, young men not much older than Thomas, but who carried themselves with the arrogance of those who believed the world owed them everything. They treated him like an afterthought, barking orders without a second glance, expecting him to clean up after them without so much as a thank you. One of the first incidents happened a few days into the job. Thomas was scrubbing the floors in the break room, minding his own business, when a group of office workers entered, laughing and joking loudly. Among them was a man named Jeff, one of Mr. Thompson's favoured employees. Jeff was tall, well-dressed, and always had an air of superiority about him. He had never said a kind word to Thomas, and today was no different. "Hey, Thomas," Jeff called out loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You missed a spot over there." He pointed to a corner of the room that was already spotless, a smirk spreading across his face. Thomas bit back a response, his grip tightening on the mop handle. He was used to this kind of treatment, patronizing, condescending, meant to remind him of his place. But something about the smug look on Jeff's face made the frustration boil beneath the surface. "Yeah, make sure you get it right," another man chimed in, his tone mocking. "We can't have Mr. Thompson's office looking anything less than perfect, now can we?" The others laughed, the sound grating in Thomas's ears. He focused on his task, scrubbing the same spot over and over, trying to ignore the way they were watching him, as if he were a zoo animal performing for their amusement. "Why don't you guys leave him alone?" A voice cut through the laughter. It was Sarah, one of the few women who worked in the office. She had always been polite to Thomas, though not overly friendly. She wasn't part of the clique that took pleasure in making his life harder, but she also didn't go out of her way to stop it. Today, however, something had clearly gotten under her skin. "Oh, come on, Sarah, we're just messing around," Jeff said, flashing her a grin. "Besides, he doesn't mind, do you, Thomas?" Thomas didn't look up, knowing that any response would only make things worse. He had learned long ago that standing up for himself in Cedar Ridge rarely led to anything good. So he kept scrubbing, letting the insults roll off him like water off a duck's back. But inside, a knot of anger twisted tighter with every word. Later that day, as Thomas was cleaning the executive offices, another incident occurred that sent his blood boiling. He had just finished polishing the floors in Mr. Thompson's private office when Mr. Thompson's son, Eric, walked in. Eric was a few years younger than Thomas, fresh out of college, and was already being groomed to take over the family business. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never known hardship, his crisp suits and expensive watch, a stark contrast to the menial labor Thomas had been assigned. Eric barely glanced at Thomas as he entered, tossing his jacket onto the couch and sitting behind his father's desk like he owned the place. "You missed the trash," Eric said casually, not bothering to look up from his phone. Thomas clenched his jaw, glancing over at the trash can, which was nearly empty. He walked over, pulled out the liner, and replaced it without a word. As he turned to leave, Eric's voice stopped him. "Hey, hold up a second," Eric said, his tone dripping with entitlement. "I need you to take care of something else." Thomas paused, suppressing the urge to snap. "Yes, sir?" Eric leaned back in the chair, a smug grin on his face. "My shoes need a bit of a shine. Think you can handle that?" For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Thomas stared at Eric, the younger man's words hanging in the air like a punch to the gut. Eric wasn't serious. He couldn't be. But the look in his eyes told Thomas everything he needed to know. This wasn't a request. It was a test, a humiliation. Thomas took a deep breath, fighting back the anger that threatened to erupt. He had faced worse than this, he told himself. He had endured far more blatant racism, more overt disrespect. But this felt different. This wasn't just about cleaning shoes. This was about reminding Thomas of his place, reminding him that no matter how smart, how qualified, how determined he was, he would always be seen as less. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," Thomas said, his voice steady but cold. "That's not part of my job." Eric's eyes narrowed, the grin fading. He stared at Thomas for a long moment, as if weighing whether or not to press the issue. Finally, he shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, turning back to his phone. "But don't forget who signs your paycheck." Thomas left the office, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to scream, to throw the mop down and walk out, but he couldn't, not yet. He needed this job as much as he hated it. The paycheck, meager as it was, kept him afloat, and for now, that was all that mattered. But as he walked through the office hallways, invisible to the employees who passed him by, a fire began to burn inside him. He wasn't going to let them break him. He wasn't going to be the quiet, obedient janitor they wanted him to be. He would bide his time, yes, but he would find a way out, and when he did, he would make sure that they all saw him for what he truly was, a man who deserved respect, not pity. As Thomas finished his shift and walked home, the humiliation of the day still weighing heavily on him, one thought kept circling in his mind. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning. Thomas awoke the next morning, the weight of the previous day's humiliation still pressing on his chest. He had barely slept, replaying the moment with Eric over and over in his mind. The anger he had felt yesterday had not subsided. If anything, it had intensified. But he knew anger alone wouldn't get him through this. He needed to channel it, to turn it into something productive. Walking away from the job wasn't an option right now. The bills still needed to be paid, and his parents were depending on him. So instead, he made a decision. If he couldn't control the way people treated him, he would control the way he responded to it. That day, Thomas arrived at the office with a newfound sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let them break him, no matter how hard they tried. He was better than this job, better than the casual cruelty of the people around him. And though he would have to swallow his pride for now, he knew this wasn't forever. He would prove his worth, not just to them, but to himself. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas threw himself into his work with a quiet determination. He showed up early, stayed late, and made sure everything he touched was spotless. The floors gleamed under his mop, the windows shone after he polished them, and the office seemed to hum with the efficiency he brought to even the smallest tasks. He took pride in his work, not because he believed cleaning floors was his calling, but because he refused to give his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him falter. The office staff, however, were relentless. The condescension continued, sometimes blatant, sometimes subtle. Jeff and his group of office buddies would still throw jabs his way whenever they passed by, making a game of trying to push his buttons. "Hey Thomas, you missed a spot," they would say, grinning at each other, as if mocking him never got old. Others would leave their trash strewn across their desks or the break room, knowing he would have to clean it up later. One afternoon, while Thomas was emptying the trash bins, Jeff sauntered over, a smug grin plastered on his face. "How's the engineering degree treating you, Thomas?" he asked, the mockery clear in his voice. "I bet those engineering skills really come in handy when you're cleaning out the toilets." The other workers in the room snickered, but Thomas didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he calmly tied up the trash bag and moved to the next bin, ignoring Jeff's taunts. His silence seemed to irritate Jeff, who stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Jeff said, his eyes narrowing. "Walking around here with your head held high like this job is beneath you. But here's the thing, Thomas. This is where you belong. And no matter how hard you work, you're never going to be one of us." Thomas paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He knew Jeff was trying to provoke him, to get him to snap. But he wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Instead, Thomas looked Jeff in the eye and spoke with a quiet strength. "I don't need to be one of you," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. "I know who I am, and I know where I'm going. This job, it's temporary, but your attitude, that's forever." Jeff's grin faltered for a moment, as if he hadn't expected Thomas to push back. He opened his mouth to say something else, but before he could, Sarah, the woman who had stood up for Thomas before, entered the room. "Jeff, stop being a jerk," she said, her voice sharp. "You've got work to do, and you're wasting time bothering Thomas. Grow up." Jeff scowled, muttering something under his breath before turning and walking away, leaving Thomas and Sarah alone. She gave Thomas a sympathetic look, her expression softening. "I don't know how you put up with him," she said, shaking her head. "Jeff's a nightmare, but you handle it better than most people would." Thomas shrugged, feeling a mixture of gratitude and frustration. "It's not easy," he admitted. "But I don't really have a choice, do I?" Sarah sighed, leaning against the counter. "I guess not." But for what it's worth, I've noticed how hard you work. You're doing a great job, even if most of these idiots don't appreciate it." Thomas nodded, feeling a small flicker of hope at her words. It wasn't much, but it was something. For so long it had felt like his efforts went unnoticed, like he was simply a ghost in the office. But hearing someone acknowledge his hard work, even if it was just Sarah, reminded him that he wasn't entirely invisible. "Thanks, Sarah," he said quietly. "That means a lot." She smiled at him, a brief but genuine expression of kindness before heading back to her desk. For a moment, Thomas allowed himself to feel a sense of relief. Not everyone in this place was against him. There were small cracks in the wall of hostility that surrounded him. And maybe, just maybe, he could use those cracks to his advantage. But the challenges didn't stop with Jeff. As time went on, it became clear that Mr. Thompson's son, Eric, had taken a particular interest in making Thomas's life harder. Eric didn't harass him openly like Jeff did, but his tactics were more subtle, more insidious. He would assign Thomas impossible tasks, expecting him to fail or leave cryptic notes on his desk with unreasonable demands. One day, he even spilled coffee all over the conference room table during a meeting, only to call Thomas in afterward to clean it up, while the other employees watched in awkward silence. Through it all, Thomas kept his head down and his resolve strong. He reminded himself of why he was doing this, not for them, but for himself. Every insult, every challenge, every demeaning task was just another test of his resilience, and each time he succeeded, he grew stronger, more determined. One evening after a particularly grueling day, Thomas sat in his small bedroom, staring at the framed engineering degree on the wall. It still felt out of reach, like a distant dream that had been deferred for too long. But something inside him had shifted. The fire that had been lit when Eric asked him to shine his shoes had not gone out. In fact, it had grown, burning brighter with each day he endured the abuse. He was not broken, he was not defeated. He had faced the worst this town had to offer, and he was still standing. And one day soon he would rise above it all. Thomas had learned to survive the relentless grind at the office, balancing his emotional strength with his quiet dignity. But beneath the surface, something more sinister was taking shape. The constant insults and menial tasks were one thing, but there was an unspoken tension in the office, something that had been gnawing at Thomas's instincts. It was in the subtle glances exchanged between Eric and a few of the senior employees, the hushed conversations that fell silent when he entered the room, and the way certain files would disappear only to reappear without explanation. It had all seemed like office politics at first, the kind of power plays that were normal in a place like this. But after weeks of observing the dynamics, Thomas started to piece together that there was something much deeper going on, something corrupt and dangerous. He wasn't sure exactly what it was, but he knew it revolved around Mr. Thompson and Eric. And now, Thomas was beginning to think that accepting this job was leading him down a path he never expected, one that went beyond simply surviving the discrimination. Late one evening, after most of the employees had gone home, Thomas was finishing his shift when he noticed that Mr. Thompson's office light was still on. It was unusual. Thompson rarely stayed this late. Thomas hesitated, but curiosity got the better of him. He moved closer, pausing just outside the door where he could hear voices. At first, the conversation was muffled, but then he caught Eric's voice, laced with tension. "You don't understand, Dad. If this gets out, we'll lose everything." Mr. Thompson's reply was low and gruff. Keep your voice down, Eric. We'll deal with it, like we always do. Thomas froze. The tone of the conversation was far from professional. There was something in their voices, fear, maybe, or desperation. He leaned in closer, careful to stay hidden. We need to make sure that everyone involved stays quiet, Eric continued. If that means paying off a few more people, then we'll do it. We can't afford any leaks. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. What were they talking about? He had suspected something was off with the way Eric handled business, but this sounded like more than just shady deals. This sounded criminal, and whatever it was, they were both neck deep in it. He carefully backed away from the door, his mind racing. As much as he wanted to know more, he couldn't risk being caught eavesdropping. The last thing he needed was to draw any more attention to himself. But as he walked back down the empty hallway, a sense of unease settled over him. There was more going on in this office than anyone realized, and he had just stumbled upon a piece of it. The next few days, Thomas kept his eyes and ears open. He started noticing things that hadn't seemed important before: Eric's frequent trips to the accounting department, the sudden influx of expensive deliveries, and the way certain employees who were close to the Thompson family seemed to always know more than they should. It was clear now that whatever was happening, it involved money, big money. One afternoon, while taking out the trash, Thomas found something strange. As he emptied a bin from one of the executive offices, a crumpled piece of paper caught his eye. It wasn't just any paper, it was a receipt for a large transfer of funds from the company's account to a private offshore bank. Thomas's hands trembled as he held the receipt, realizing what it meant. This wasn't just mismanagement or a shady deal. This was fraud, serious fraud. He tucked the receipt into his pocket, his heart racing. This was the proof he had been looking for. But what was he supposed to do with it? He couldn't go to the authorities. He was just a janitor, and no one would believe him. Besides, if he made a move too soon, Eric and Mr. Thompson would find a way to pin everything on him. They were powerful men in Cedar Ridge, and Thomas had no doubt that they could destroy him if they wanted to. As the weight of his discovery pressed down on him, Thomas realized that he couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed help, someone who could guide him on how to proceed without putting himself in harm's way. His mind raced through the few people he could trust, and only one name stood out: Sarah. Over the weeks, Sarah had been one of the few people in the office who treated Thomas with basic human decency. She wasn't part of the inner circle, but she was smart, resourceful, and, most importantly, she wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. If anyone could help him figure out what to do next, it was her. The next morning, Thomas approached Sarah as she was pouring herself a cup of coffee in the break room. His stomach churned with nerves as he quietly pulled her aside. "Sarah, can I talk to you for a second?" he asked, his voice low.
She looked at him curiously, but nodded. "Sure, what's up?"
He glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot before speaking again. I think something serious is going on in this company. I've found some things that don't add up." Sarah frowned, her expression shifting to concern. "What do you mean?" Thomas pulled the crumpled receipt from his pocket and handed it to her. "I found this in one of the trash bins. It's a transfer to an offshore account. There's more too. Eric and Mr. Thompson are involved in something shady, and I overheard them talking about paying people off to keep it quiet." Sarah's eyes widened as she looked at the receipt, her face paling. She glanced back at Thomas, her voice barely a whisper. "This is serious, Thomas. If what you're saying is true—" "It is," Thomas interrupted, his voice urgent. but I don't know what to do. If I go to the authorities, they'll just say I'm making it up, and I'll be the one who ends up getting in trouble, but we can't just let this slide. They're committing fraud, maybe worse. Sarah bit her lip, deep in thought. After a long moment, she nodded slowly. You're right, we can't let this slide, but we need more proof, something solid, something that can't be dismissed. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. He wasn't in this alone anymore. Together they could figure out how to bring the truth to light without putting themselves in danger. We'll need to be careful, Sarah continued, her voice steady but determined. If we're going to do this, we have to make sure we have everything in place before we take any action. One wrong move and they'll come after us both. Thomas nodded, feeling a sense of solidarity for the first time since starting this job. He didn't know how long it would take or what the final outcome would be, but he was ready. The injustice that had surrounded him his whole life was finally facing a reckoning, and this time he wasn't going to let it pass him by. Together they would uncover the shadows and bring the truth into the light. With Sarah now on his side, Thomas felt a renewed sense of determination. For the first time since taking the job at Thompson Enterprises, he wasn't just reacting to the mistreatment or keeping his head down to survive. He had a purpose now, a chance to expose the corruption at the heart of the company. But he knew this wouldn't be easy. Mr. Thompson and Eric were powerful men, and uncovering their secrets without getting caught would take careful planning. Over the next few days, Thomas and Sarah began laying the groundwork for their investigation. They couldn't risk being seen together too often, so they communicated through brief, whispered conversations or cryptic notes left in places only they would know to look. Their first goal was to gather more concrete evidence, documents, emails, anything that could prove the fraud and expose the conspiracy that Thomas suspected ran deep within the company. One afternoon, while cleaning the executive offices, Thomas stumbled upon another clue. He had learned to move quietly and unnoticed, blending into the background as he worked, and this allowed him to overhear more conversations than most people realized. Today he overheard Mr. Thompson on the phone, his voice tense as he discussed a deal with someone on the other end. "I don't care what the auditors say," Mr. Thompson barked. "We're not changing the numbers. They'll get their cut like always. Just make sure the books are clean when they take a look." Thomas's heart raced as he mopped the floors nearby, pretending to be oblivious. He knew this was important, proof that Thompson was cooking the books to cover up whatever scheme he had going. But he needed more than just overheard conversations. He needed something he could document. That night he met Sarah in a quiet corner of the office parking lot. It was late, and most of the employees had already gone home, but Thomas and Sarah had waited until they were sure no one would notice them slipping out to meet. "I overheard something today," Thomas said, his voice hushed but urgent. "Mr. Thompson was on the phone talking about altering the books. He's definitely hiding something." Sarah's eyes widened. "That's huge. But we need to get proof of it. Real proof. Can we access the financial records?"
Thomas shook his head. "I've tried, but everything's locked down. The only people with access are Mr. Thompson, Eric, and a couple of the senior accountants." Sarah frowned, thinking, "What about Eric's computer? He's careless. I've seen him leave it unlocked before when he steps away from his desk. If we can get into his emails, there might be something there."
Thomas hesitated. Breaking into Eric's computer would be risky. If they got caught, it would be over. But it was the best lead they had. "I'll watch for an opportunity," he said. "If he leaves it unlocked again, I'll make my move." Over the next few days, Thomas kept a close eye on Eric's movements, waiting for the right moment. Finally, his chance came. Late one afternoon, Eric stormed out of his office in a huff, muttering something about a meeting and leaving his computer screen on. Thomas quickly moved in, his heart pounding in his chest. He slid into Eric's chair and pulled up his email inbox. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he searched for anything that looked suspicious. Most of the emails were mundane. Corporate memos, project updates, and personal correspondence. But then he found it, a string of emails between Eric, Mr. Thompson, and a mysterious third party, all discussing payments, altered invoices, and how to avoid detection by auditors. Thomas quickly snapped pictures of the emails with his phone, careful not to leave any trace of his presence. He also found a folder labeled Special Projects, which contained detailed financial reports that clearly showed large sums of money being funneled into offshore accounts. This was it, the proof they needed. He barely had time to save the files to a USB drive before Eric returned, looking frustrated and annoyed. Thomas calmly stood up, giving Eric a polite nod as he continued his cleaning rounds, but inside his heart was racing. He had what they needed. That evening, Thomas and Sarah met again in the parking lot, their faces tense but determined. "I got into his emails," Thomas said, handing her the USB drive. "There's enough evidence on here to blow this whole thing wide open." Sarah took the drive, her expression serious. "This is huge, Thomas. We've got everything we need, but now we need to be smart about how we use it." They both knew that going directly to the authorities could be dangerous. Mr. Thompson and Eric had deep connections in the town, and if they were tipped off before the investigation could be launched, they might find a way to cover their tracks. Worse, they could turn the tables on Thomas and Sarah, making them look like the criminals. "We need to take this to someone outside the company," Sarah said. "Someone with power who isn't connected to the Thompsons. I know a lawyer who specializes in corporate fraud. He's tough, and he doesn't take bribes. If we bring this to him, he can make sure it gets to the right people without anyone inside the company finding out." Thomas nodded. "Let's do it. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it gets." Over the next few days, they worked out a plan. Sarah contacted the lawyer, setting up a meeting to hand over the evidence. In the meantime, they continued to gather any additional information they could without raising suspicion. It was a tense time, each day feeling like they were walking a tightrope, but they knew they were getting closer to their goal. Finally, the day of the meeting arrived. Sarah and Thomas met the lawyer in a small cafe outside of town, a neutral location where they wouldn't be recognized. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s named Mr. Roberts, listened carefully as Sarah explained everything they had discovered. He examined the emails, the financial records, and the other documents they had collected. "This is solid," Mr. Roberts said, nodding as he scrolled through the files on the USB drive. "You've done the right thing bringing this to me. I'll make sure it gets to the proper authorities, and I'll make sure they launch a formal investigation. You don't need to worry about retaliation. Once this is out, the Thompsons won't be able to touch you."
Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. For the first time, it felt like the nightmare was coming to an end. He had done it. He had stood up not just to the racism and mistreatment he had faced, but to the larger corruption that had infected the company. And soon, justice would be served. But as Thomas and Sarah left the cafe, they couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. They had struck the first blow, but the Thompsons were powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight.
Thomas and Sarah had barely slept since handing over the evidence to Mr. Roberts. The weight of what they had done, challenging the most powerful family in Cedar Ridge, hung heavily over them. While they trusted Mr. Roberts to move forward with the case, they also knew that exposing the truth would bring consequences. For a few days, nothing happened. The office hummed with its usual tension, and Eric and Mr. Thompson went about their business, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. But that quiet felt like the calm before a hurricane. Thomas and Sarah were both on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then the backlash began. It started with something small. Thomas arrived at work one morning to find his cleaning supplies scattered around the janitor's closet. Brooms snapped in half, cleaning fluid spilled across the floor, and his uniform had been slashed with a knife. It was a clear message. Someone knew. But it was subtle enough that it could still be passed off as a random act of vandalism, nothing worth reporting to the authorities. Thomas clenched his fists, knowing better. He'd been through this before, back when he'd first started working at Thompson Enterprises. The petty sabotage, the deliberate humiliation, it was all designed to make him feel small, to make him doubt himself, to make him quit. But this time he wasn't alone. Sarah faced her own challenges. Her workload suddenly tripled. Eric began dumping last-minute projects on her desk, always with impossible deadlines. Meetings that she'd once been a part of were now held without her. Coworkers she'd been friendly with suddenly turned cold, offering nothing but silence or disdain when she spoke. It was as if the entire office had turned against her overnight. "I knew they'd come after us," Sarah muttered one afternoon as she and Thomas huddled in the break room. "They're trying to wear us down." "They're scared," Thomas replied quietly. "They know what's coming, but they don't know who's behind it yet. They're trying to flush us out." But Thomas's words did little to ease the growing anxiety that gnawed at him. It wasn't just the personal attacks or the sudden cold shoulders from his co-workers. He could handle those. What worried him was the silence from Mr. Roberts. A week had passed since their meeting, and they hadn't heard a word from the lawyer. No updates, no confirmation that the investigation was moving forward. Sarah tried to call him several times, but her messages went unanswered. "Do you think something's happened to him?" she asked one evening, her voice tight with worry. Thomas shook his head, though doubt clouded his mind. "I don't know." He seemed confident that we were safe. But the truth was, Cedar Ridge was a small town and the Thompsons had deep roots. They had connections that stretched far beyond the office. Could they have gotten to Mr. Roberts? It seemed unlikely, but the possibility weighed on Thomas like a stone. A few days later, they got their answer. Thomas was in the middle of cleaning the break room when his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "We have a problem. Meet me at the cafe in 10. Heart pounding, Thomas quickly finished up his task and headed to the small cafe where they'd first met with Mr. Roberts. When he arrived, Sarah was already there, looking pale and tense. "They're pulling strings, Thomas," she said, barely able to keep her voice steady. "I just got off the phone with Mr. Roberts. He's been forced off the case." "What? How?" Thomas asked, his throat tightening. Sarah swallowed hard. Thompson's lawyers have pressured his firm. Apparently, they threatened to bury them in lawsuits unless they dropped the investigation. Roberts tried to fight it, but the partners caved. He's been ordered to stop pursuing our case. Thomas sat down, stunned. "So, what does that mean? Are we back to square one?"
"Not exactly," Sarah said, trying to keep her composure. "Roberts didn't want to abandon us, but his hands are tied. He gave me the name of another lawyer, someone outside of Cedar Ridge who doesn't have ties to the Thompsons. We'll have to go through them now, but it's going to take time."
Time. That was the one thing they didn't have. Thomas clenched his fists in frustration. They're buying themselves time to cover their tracks. Sarah nodded grimly. That's exactly what they're doing. But we have to be careful, Thomas. If they find out we're the ones behind the investigation, they won't stop at intimidation. They'll come after us for real. The weight of Sarah's words settled over them like a dark cloud. The Thompsons had the resources to destroy lives, whether through legal means or more underhanded tactics. Thomas could already feel the walls closing in, but giving up wasn't an option. They had come too far. What do we do now? Thomas asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Sarah sighed. We lay low for a bit. We keep gathering information, but we don't make any big moves until the new lawyer is ready to take the case. In the meantime, we need to act like everything's normal. No one can know we're involved. The idea of playing along, of pretending like nothing was happening, felt like a heavy burden. But Thomas knew it was their only option for now. As much as he wanted to confront Mr. Thompson and Eric, to demand answers and expose them for the frauds they were, he had to be patient. Over the next few days, Thomas and Sarah did their best to stay under the radar. They avoided each other in the office, limiting their communication to brief glances or the occasional text message. Thomas focused on his work even as the petty sabotage continued. Someone had slashed his tires one morning, and there were rumors circulating about his competence as a janitor. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the investigation and making sure they were ready when the time came to strike. Then, something unexpected happened. Thomas was cleaning the conference room late one evening when he found an envelope lying on the table. It had no name or address, just the word truth scrawled on the front in messy handwriting. Frowning, Thomas picked it up and quickly tucked it into his pocket, glancing around to make sure no one had seen him. Once he was alone, he opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a photocopy of what looked like a police report dated several years ago. The name at the top of the report stopped Thomas cold. Eric Thompson. His eyes scanned the document, disbelief washing over him as he read the charges. Driving under the influence, obstruction of justice, and bribery of a police officer. But the most shocking part was at the bottom, where the case had been marked as dismissed. Eric had walked away without so much as a slap on the wrist, and the entire report had been buried. Thomas's hands trembled as he stared at the paper. This was it, the key to exposing Eric's character, to showing the world what kind of man the Thompsons really were. And someone inside the company had just handed it to him. The question was, who and why now? As Thomas pocketed the report, he realized that the game had just changed. He wasn't sure who had left the document for him, but one thing was clear. The Thompsons' secrets were starting to unravel, and it wouldn't be long before everything came crashing down. He just had to make sure he survived long enough to see it happen. The discovery of the police report shook Thomas to his core. As he sat alone in his apartment that night, he reread the document over and over, trying to make sense of it. Someone had left this for him. Someone who knew about Eric's dark past and wanted him to use it. But who could it be? And why now, when tensions were already at their peak? The next morning at work, Thomas kept his head down, wary of every glance from his coworkers. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him more closely than usual. Was it the person who had left the envelope? Or was it someone trying to figure out what he knew? He considered telling Sarah about the report but hesitated. The fewer people who knew, the safer they both were. Still, it was a heavy burden to carry alone. By the end of the day, Thomas was mentally exhausted. As he made his way out of the office, he noticed Eric standing in the parking lot, laughing with a few of the other managers. The sight of him, so carefree and smug, sent a wave of anger through Thomas. This man had not only gotten away with breaking the law, but was also orchestrating the harassment Thomas faced daily. And now, with the evidence of Eric's criminal record in his hands, Thomas knew he could finally expose him. But he also knew it wasn't the right time.
As he approached his car, a voice called out behind him, "Thomas."
He turned, surprised to see Mr. Thompson's secretary, Miss Allison, walking toward him. She was a quiet woman, always impeccably dressed and professional, but she never spoke more than necessary. "Miss Allison?" Thomas asked, confused by her approach. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice low but urgent. "Somewhere private." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. Was she the one who had left the report? He hesitated, glancing around the parking lot, but no one seemed to be paying attention to them. "All right," he agreed cautiously. "Where?" "Follow me," she said, turning quickly and heading toward a nearby alley that led to the back of the building. Thomas followed her, his mind racing. Once they were out of sight, Miss Allison turned to face him, her expression tense. "I know about the report you found." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. "You left it for me." She nodded. "Yes, but there's more you need to know." "Why are you helping me?" Thomas asked, still trying to wrap his mind around the situation. Miss Allison sighed, her usually calm demeanor breaking just slightly. "I've worked for Mr. Thompson for over 20 years. I've seen a lot of things in this company, things that should have never been allowed to happen, but I always kept my mouth shut because I didn't think I had a choice. The Thompsons own this town, and going against them can ruin your life." She paused, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. "But when I saw how they were treating you, how Eric and his father have been covering up their crimes for so long, I couldn't stay silent anymore, especially not after what happened with Eric years ago." Thomas frowned. "You mean the DUI?"
Miss Allison nodded. Eric was drunk and crashed his car into a parked vehicle late one night. The police came and they were ready to arrest him, but Mr. Thompson stepped in. He paid off the officers and the whole thing disappeared. Eric got off without a scratch, just like he always does.
"That's why you left me the report," Thomas realized. "To expose him?"
"Yes," she said, her voice fierce now. "Eric has been protected by his father for too long. He's dangerous, Thomas. He's not just an arrogant bully. He's capable of much worse. And if you don't handle this carefully, they'll come after you with everything they have."
Thomas's mind raced. But why now? Why give me the report now, when they're already on edge about the investigation? "Because you've shown more courage than anyone else in that office," she said quietly. "You're the only one who's ever stood up to them, and I believe you can finish what you've started. But you can't do it alone." Thomas took a deep breath, trying to process everything. "What do we do next?" Miss Allison's eyes narrowed. "We use the report to force their hand, but not yet. First, you need to protect yourself. If the Thompsons get even a whiff that you're planning something, they'll bury you." Thomas nodded, understanding the gravity of her warning. "So, we wait?" "For now, yes," she said. "I'll keep gathering information from inside. There are more people like me, people who have been silent for too long. If we can build a coalition, we might have a real shot at bringing them down." Her words hung in the air, filled with hope and danger. Thomas felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Miss Allison's quiet strength gave him the courage he needed to keep pushing forward. "I'll be careful," Thomas promised. "But when the time comes, I'll make sure the truth comes out." Miss Allison gave him a small, tight-lipped smile. "Good. Just don't let your guard down, Thomas. The Thompsons are powerful, but they're not invincible. We just need to be smarter." As she turned to leave, Thomas stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. He wasn't sure how long it would take or how many obstacles they would have to overcome, but for the first time since taking the job, he felt like victory was within reach. With the support of an unexpected ally, Thomas now had the tools and the resolve to take on the Thompsons, but he knew the hardest part was still ahead. The battle for justice had only just begun. In the days that followed his meeting with Miss Allison, Thomas remained vigilant. He felt the undercurrents of tension in the office intensify, but he couldn't afford to show any signs of weakness. He continued to perform his duties diligently, but now with a purpose. Each time he entered the building, he reminded himself that he was gathering not just evidence but also allies. Sarah had noticed the shift in his demeanor. "You seem different lately," she commented one afternoon as they shared a quiet moment in the break room. "More determined, maybe?" Thomas hesitated before responding. He wanted to share everything, but the stakes were too high. "Just trying to keep my head down and do my job," he said nonchalantly.
"Right," Sarah replied, skepticism lacing her tone. "Just don't forget to take care of yourself in the process. This place can get to you."
"Trust me, I'm keeping it together," Thomas assured her, though the truth felt more fragile than ever. He wanted to confide in her about Miss Allison's support and their plan to expose Eric and his father, but fear of what might happen if the Thompsons found out kept him silent. The following week, Thomas and Miss Allison began meeting regularly, always in secret. They would talk at the back of the building or in her car during lunch breaks. She shared snippets of information about Eric's behavior and any unguarded comments she overheard from Mr. Thompson. It was all small pieces of a much larger puzzle, but they were beginning to see a clearer picture. One afternoon, Miss Allison rushed into their meeting looking frazzled. "You won't believe what I just overheard," she said breathlessly, glancing around as if to ensure they weren't being watched. "Mr. Thompson is planning to make some significant changes in the company, starting with you." "Me?" Thomas asked, startled. "What do you mean?" "He's worried about the investigation and wants to make sure you're either intimidated into leaving or simply removed from the picture. I overheard him discussing a possible demotion, something to make you look incompetent in front of everyone." Thomas felt a surge of anger. "They think they can just push me around after everything they've done?"
"Exactly," Miss Allison said, her eyes fierce. "But this could work to our advantage. If they demote you, it could give you the leverage we need. It would show everyone that the Thompsons are desperate to silence you." "Desperate," Thomas repeated, letting the word roll over him. "Maybe this is our opening. If they think I'm no longer a threat, they might become careless." Miss Allison smiled slightly, sensing the shift in his energy. "We can't act too quickly. We still need to gather more evidence about the Thompsons' corruption, something that'll hold up in court and really shock the town. We can't just rely on Eric's past." Thomas nodded, feeling a sense of purpose return. "Then we keep doing what we're doing, building our case quietly. And when the time is right, we strike back." As their conversations continued, Thomas grew more focused and methodical in his work. He documented every incident of discrimination he faced, every time someone undermined him or
laughed at his expense. He began to gather evidence from other employees, many of whom felt similarly oppressed. As he listened to their stories, a sense of camaraderie formed among them, all motivated by a shared desire for change. Meanwhile, Sarah began to notice a shift in the office atmosphere. Whispers echoed through the halls, and a sense of rebellion seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. Employees who once laughed at Thomas's expense were now more wary of making jokes or belittling him. It felt as though the Thompsons' grip on the company was beginning to loosen. One afternoon, while organizing his supplies in the janitor's closet, Thomas overheard Eric and Mr. Thompson discussing their plans. "Get rid of him, Eric," Mr. Thompson barked. "If we can demote him, or better yet, scare him into quitting, it'll send a message to anyone else who thinks they can stand up to us. This is our town, and we won't let anyone disrupt our business." "Just say the word, Dad," Eric replied, his voice dripping with malice. "I'll handle it." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. They were serious about their threats. This wasn't just workplace harassment anymore. They were actively plotting against him. He took a deep breath and stepped away from the door, heart racing. He couldn't let fear consume him. He needed to act swiftly but wisely. He returned to his work, determined to stay one step ahead of them. That evening, he met with Miss Allison again. "They're planning to make a move against me," he told her, his voice low. "Eric and his father want to intimidate me into quitting." Miss Allison frowned, considering the implications. "This could be the tipping point. We can't let them scare you off. We need to be ready to expose them when they make their move." "Right," Thomas agreed, the fire in his belly igniting. "But we have to be smart about it. We can't just react. We need to control the narrative." The following days were filled with tension as Thomas and Miss Allison worked behind the scenes. They collected additional evidence from other employees who had faced similar harassment. Some were hesitant to speak up, fearful of retaliation, but others were emboldened by Thomas's determination to stand his ground. One evening, just as they were about to leave the office, Sarah approached Thomas with an uneasy expression. "I need to talk to you. It's about Eric." "What's happened?" Thomas asked, his heart racing. "I overheard him talking to some of the other managers," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're planning a company-wide meeting, and they want to announce changes that will directly affect you." "What kind of changes?" Thomas asked, worry gnawing at him. "Something about restructuring and demotions. They're framing it as a way to improve efficiency, but I think they're targeting you specifically." Thomas felt a wave of anger wash over him. "They think they can just push me out? No way. We need to use this to our advantage."
"Exactly," Sarah said, her eyes lighting up. "If they make a big public announcement, it could galvanize the other employees. It'll show everyone how desperate they are." He could see the fire in her eyes, the determination to fight back. "We can't let them win," he said firmly. "We have to make sure everyone knows what's really happening behind the scenes." As the days passed, anticipation hung thick in the air. The scheduled company meeting loomed, and Thomas knew it could either be their greatest challenge or their best opportunity. He could feel the energy shifting among the employees. Some were angry, some were scared, and some were starting to rally behind him. But they all needed a reason to stand together. The night before the meeting, Thomas sat down with Sarah and Miss Allison to strategize. They needed a plan that would not only expose the Thompsons, but also unify the employees against the injustices they faced.
"We need a presentation. Something that will grab their attention and keep it," Thomas suggested, pacing the small room. "We can't let them control the narrative." Miss Allison nodded. "We should gather all the evidence we have and lay it out clearly. If we show them the truth, we can make it undeniable.
Sarah chimed in. And we need to emphasize that this isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's been mistreated in this company. If we can make it personal for them, they'll be more likely to join us.
With the plan taking shape, they worked late into the night, preparing their materials and honing their message. The gravity of what they were about to do weighed heavily on Thomas's shoulders. This was it. The moment that could change everything. As he finally crawled into bed, exhaustion overtook him, but beneath it lay a current of adrenaline. Tomorrow could be the turning point in their fight for justice. No matter what happened, they had to stand together, united in their demand for change. With that thought in mind, Thomas closed his eyes, steeling himself for the storm that was about to unfold. The next morning, the atmosphere in the office buzzed with nervous energy. Employees filed into the conference room, a mix of curiosity and trepidation evident in their expressions. Thomas could feel the weight of their eyes on him as he entered, accompanied by Miss Allison and Sarah. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of the importance of what they were about to do. As they settled into their seats, Thomas noticed Eric leaning against the wall at the back of the room, a smug smile plastered across his face. His presence only fueled Thomas's determination to expose the truth. Mr. Thompson stood at the front, ready to deliver his usual self-congratulatory speech about the company's progress, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Thompson began, his voice booming. "Today we'll be discussing some changes to improve efficiency and productivity in our workplace. Change is necessary for growth, and I'm confident these adjustments will benefit us all." As he droned on, Thomas exchanged glances with Sarah and Miss Allison, their hearts racing with anticipation. It was almost time. Finally, Mr. Thompson gestured toward Eric. "Eric will now outline our new structure and how we plan to streamline operations. He has great ideas for ensuring that our team remains competitive." Thomas could see Eric reveling in the spotlight, eager to deliver the bad news. He spoke with practiced confidence, outlining a series of demotions and shifts in responsibilities that would effectively undermine Thomas's position. As Eric concluded, Thomas felt a surge of anger rise within him. This was it, the moment to take back control. He stood up, his voice steady but filled with passion. "Excuse me, Eric, I'd like to address the group." Gasps echoed around the room and Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. "Thomas, this isn't the time." "I think it is," Thomas interjected, his tone firm. "You're talking about changes that affect all of us, but you're failing to acknowledge the real issues at play here." "Thomas, sit down," Eric sneered, but Thomas held his ground. "I won't sit down," he said, the courage building inside him. "This isn't just about me, it's about every single employee in this room who has faced discrimination, harassment, or intimidation at the hands of management." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of surprise and intrigue. Thomas could see hesitant nods among his colleagues, and he pressed on. "For too long, we've been silent. For too long, we've accepted a toxic environment where our voices are ignored, but not anymore." He reached into his bag and pulled out a stack of documents, the evidence he and Miss Allison had meticulously gathered over the past weeks. "I have proof of the racial discrimination and misconduct happening in this company. I have evidence of Eric's DUI and the cover-up orchestrated by Mr. Thompson to protect his son." Gasps erupted around the room. The tension was palpable as he began distributing copies of the documents. "We've been treated like second-class citizens, but we're done being silenced. It's time to hold our leaders accountable for their actions." Mr. Thompson's face turned beet red. "You have no right to do this. You'll regret it."
"I'm not afraid of you," Thomas replied, his voice steady. "You think you can intimidate me? You're wrong. We are not here to be your scapegoats. We deserve to work in an environment where we are respected and valued."
The room was alive with murmurs now, the employees exchanging looks of disbelief and rising defiance. Sarah stepped forward beside Thomas, her voice strong. "We're here to stand together. We have the right to speak up and demand justice." Miss Allison joined them, adding her voice to the chorus. "We're tired of the Thompsons using their power to manipulate and control us. It's time for a change, and we're not backing down." The tide had turned. Thomas could feel the energy in the room shift as more employees began to speak up, sharing their experiences of discrimination and their desire for change. It was as if a dam had broken, unleashing years of pent-up frustration and anger. Eric stepped forward, his bravado faltering. "You're all being manipulated. This is just a ploy to get sympathy." But the more he protested, the more people rallied behind Thomas. Their voices rose in a chorus of solidarity, echoing through the conference room as they united against the Thompsons' oppressive reign. Mr. Thompson, now visibly shaken, attempted to regain control of the meeting. "This is unacceptable. You're all going to regret this insubordination. I will not tolerate this behavior." "Perhaps it's you who needs to be held accountable," Thomas shot back. "You've created a hostile work environment and we're demanding change. We're not backing down anymore." In that moment, Thomas felt a surge of strength. He had transformed from the target of ridicule to a symbol of hope for his co-workers. It was no longer just his fight. It was theirs too. As the meeting continued, the atmosphere shifted. Employees began to share their stories openly, emboldened by Thomas's courage. The once muted voices of discontent morphed into a powerful declaration of unity. The more they spoke, the more Thomas could see the Thompsons' hold over the company slipping away. As the meeting wrapped up, Mr. Thompson looked defeated. "We will address this." "Address it," Thomas interrupted. "No. You need to face the consequences of your actions. We will not be silenced or intimidated any longer." With that, Thomas gathered the remaining documents and walked out of the conference room, flanked by Sarah and Miss Allison. The momentum was palpable, and he knew that their fight had only just begun. Outside, the sun shone brightly, illuminating their path. Thomas felt a sense of liberation wash over him. No matter what the Thompsons tried next, they had taken the first step towards justice. As they regrouped outside, the atmosphere was charged with excitement. Thomas turned to his allies, his heart racing with anticipation. "What do we do now?" Miss Allison smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Now we take this to the next level. We need to rally support from the community, document everything, and prepare to expose them fully. We're just getting started." The trio stood united, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. Thomas felt hope blossom within him, fueled by the strength of those around him. Together, they would dismantle the power the Thompsons held over their lives piece by piece. As they walked away from the building, Thomas could see a future where they were no longer just surviving, but thriving, a future where justice would not just be delayed, but finally served. And he was determined to make it happen. In the days that followed the dramatic meeting, the atmosphere within the company began to shift even further. Thomas, Sarah, and Miss Allison worked tirelessly, rallying support among their colleagues and preparing for the next steps in their fight for justice. They knew that this was only the beginning, and they were determined to see it through. Word of Thomas's bold stand against the Thompsons spread quickly throughout the office and the surrounding community. Employees who had previously remained silent began to approach him, sharing their stories of discrimination and harassment. Each conversation reinforced their resolve. They weren't alone in this fight, and the power dynamics within the company were beginning to tilt in their favor. That Friday, Thomas, Sarah, and Miss Allison decided to organize a meeting with their fellow employees outside of work hours. They reserved a small community center room in the heart of town, believing it was essential to create a space where they could speak freely without fear of retaliation. As they prepared for the gathering, Thomas felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Would enough people show up? Would they be willing to take a stand alongside him? The evening of the meeting arrived, and the room quickly filled with employees. Some he recognized, and others he didn't. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, and as he stepped up to address the crowd, he could feel the weight of their hopes resting on his shoulders. "Thank you all for coming," Thomas began, his voice steady. "We're here because we believe in change. We believe that everyone in this room deserves to work in an environment where they are treated with respect, regardless of the color of their skin or their background." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Thomas continued. "The Thompsons have created a culture of fear and intimidation, but we have the power to change that. Together we can demand accountability and push for a better workplace." Sarah took the stage next, passionately sharing her experiences and the stories of other employees who had faced similar challenges. "This is not just about one person, it's about all of us. We can't allow the Thompsons to continue their reign of discrimination and harassment. We need to unite and stand up for what's right." As the evening progressed, more employees shared their stories. One by one, they spoke out against the injustices they had faced, echoing the sentiments of frustration and pain. Thomas felt a sense of camaraderie growing within the room, a collective understanding that they were no longer alone in their fight. After a few hours of sharing stories, they began discussing concrete actions they could take. "We need to document everything," Thomas suggested. "Every instance of discrimination, every harassment complaint, everything. We should compile it into a report that can't be ignored." "Exactly," Miss Allison chimed in. "And we need to bring this to the community. We can't just address this internally. We need to involve the local media, local leaders, and perhaps even organize a public demonstration to show how serious we are about this issue." The group nodded in agreement, and Thomas could see the determination in their eyes. They were ready to take action. Over the next few weeks, they organized their efforts, pooling their documentation and stories into a comprehensive report. They also worked on a press release, detailing their experiences and the ongoing discrimination within the company. With each passing day, the momentum grew. More employees began to sign petitions, and word spread beyond the walls of the office. Local activists and community leaders began to take notice, reaching out to offer their support. The Thompsons' stronghold was cracking, and Thomas could feel it. However, the Thompsons were not going to back down easily. As the pressure mounted, Thomas noticed subtle changes in the office atmosphere. The Thompsons began to retaliate. They started firing employees who were vocal in their support of Thomas. Rumors circulated about potential layoffs, and fear began to creep back into the hearts of some workers. One day, while Thomas was in the break room, he overheard Eric speaking to a group of managers. "We can't let them think they're winning. We need to show them who's in charge." Thomas clenched his fists, feeling the anger boiling inside him. He turned to Sarah and whispered, "They're planning something. We can't let them intimidate us again."
"I know," Sarah replied, her expression determined. "We need to keep the pressure on. We can't let them silence us."
As they continued to work on their campaign, they organized a public demonstration outside the company headquarters. It would be a way to galvanize community support and draw attention to their cause. The date was set, and the anticipation was palpable. When the day of the demonstration arrived, Thomas stood among a crowd of employees and supporters, holding a sign that read, "Justice for All." The atmosphere was electric, with chants echoing through the air. People from the community joined in solidarity, amplifying their voices. "This is our moment," Thomas shouted, rallying the crowd. "We will not be silenced any longer. We deserve a workplace where we are treated with dignity and respect." The energy was infectious, and as they marched around the building, they drew the attention of local media. Reporters began to film, and soon news crews arrived to cover the demonstration. This was exactly what they needed, a chance to share their stories with the wider community. As they marched, Thomas spotted Miss Allison on the sidelines, handing out flyers detailing their plight. She caught his eye and smiled, a silent assurance that they were all in this together. Just then he noticed Mr. Thompson and Eric standing in a window on the upper floor watching the protest unfold. Their expressions were a mix of disbelief and anger, but Thomas saw something else in their eyes: fear. With every chant, with every sign raised, Thomas felt the power of the community behind them. The Thompsons could no longer hide behind their wealth and influence. They were exposed, and Thomas was ready to ensure they faced the consequences of their actions. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the crowd, Thomas felt an overwhelming sense of hope. They were no longer just employees fighting against discrimination. They had become a movement, a force to be reckoned with, and together they would ensure that justice would not only be delayed, but finally served. In the wake of the demonstration, the local news stations picked up the story, spreading it far beyond the confines of their small town. Reporters interviewed employees, highlighted their experiences, and showcased the growing movement against racial discrimination at the Thompsons company. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForThomas and #EndRacialDiscrimination, further amplifying their message. As public support continued to swell, pressure mounted on Mr. Thompson and Eric. Their facade of control began to crumble as community members rallied behind Thomas and his colleagues. People began boycotting the company, refusing to patronize a business that turned a blind eye to systemic racism and discrimination. With each passing day, Thomas noticed a significant shift in the workplace. Those who had once been hesitant to speak up began to feel emboldened. Employees were sharing their stories openly, and the atmosphere of fear that had once permeated the office was replaced by a sense of solidarity. However, the Thompsons were not going to go down without a fight. They initiated legal action against Thomas and the employees, claiming defamation and character assassination. This only fueled the fire of public outrage. Community members, local leaders, and civil rights organizations rallied behind Thomas, providing legal support and resources for their defense. As the court date approached, Thomas found himself reflecting on the journey he had taken. He remembered the moments of despair and the struggle to be heard, but now he was surrounded by a community that believed in justice, and they were willing to fight for it. On the day of the court proceedings, the atmosphere was electric. Supporters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that proclaimed their solidarity with Thomas and demanding justice. Reporters filled the area, eager to capture every moment of the unfolding drama. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Thomas, flanked by his attorney and Miss Allison, prepared to face the Thompsons and their legal team. He could see Mr. Thompson, his demeanor arrogant and defiant, seated at the front, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. The reality of the situation was sinking in. They were facing a united front that could no longer be ignored. The proceedings began and Thomas took the stand to share his story. He spoke passionately about his experiences of racial discrimination, detailing the hostility he faced in the workplace. With every word, he laid bare the ugly truths that had long been hidden. As the defense presented their case, it became increasingly clear that the Thompsons had underestimated the strength of Thomas and his supporters. They tried to discredit him, to paint him as an unreliable narrator, but the evidence was irrefutable. The testimonies of other employees corroborated his claims, and the documents they had compiled painted a damning picture of the company's toxic culture. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Thomas held his breath as the judge addressed the court. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Thomas Reynolds." Cheers erupted from the crowd outside the courthouse as supporters celebrated the victory. Thomas felt tears of relief and joy streaming down his face. He had fought against a powerful adversary and emerged victorious. In the aftermath of the trial, the Thompsons were held accountable for their actions. The company underwent significant changes, with new policies put in place to promote diversity and inclusion. The board of directors was restructured and Thomas was offered a leadership position to help ensure that the workplace was transformed into one that valued respect and equality. As Thomas stepped into his new role, he felt a sense of purpose. As we wrap up Thomas's incredible journey, we are reminded that the fight for justice is far from over. His resilience in the face of discrimination serves as a beacon of hope for us all. If Thomas's story resonated with you and inspired you to take action in your own life, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that challenge injustice and celebrate triumphs. We want to hear from you. How do you think we can work together to combat discrimination in our communities? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let's spark a conversation that leads to change. Remember, every action counts, and together we can create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. Thank you for joining us today, and until next time, keep standing up for what's right.